Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Emergency Podcast. I'm Ian Bailey.
And I'm Nigel Goodwin.
And I'm glad that we're not being reactive to events quite as much as we had been. Otherwise, we would have been doing endless emergency podcasts over the weekend, speculating about whether Donald Trump is still breathing, which has been quite entertaining, especially where, I don't know whether you saw this, but MAGA started releasing what effectively are proof of life videos, right, of him golfing, but he turned out to have been shot in June.
I know. That's where you need. I mean, the moment you're having to release, or your supporters are having to release proof of life videos or proof of life photos, you've kind of lost the debate here. I think. Look, I mean, I'm sure he's doing just fine. I'm sure he just had a little sniffle or something, or he was busy. He was busy ranting about something else. I'm sure he's fine, and and we can look forward to many more.
But he hasn't been ranting on X, though, or Truth Social. Somebody has been Donald Trump, but it clearly isn't him when you look at the way that it's written and the style and all the rest.
Maybe his fingers and thumbs are hurting or something. I don't know. Maybe he just decided to outsource his tweeting to to an American worker to help create jobs and stimulate the economy. I don't know.
Well, maybe so. And I think we all miss Donald giving us his vision for how America should be run. And that pivots very neatly into what this week's show is about, because I think we talked about this. There are competing visions now of the kind of Britain that we want to have, right? And I want to talk a little bit about almost like a choice of visions, because we have got, obviously, the one where Nigel Farage and Reform get crowded out by everybody else, and then we carry on with the status quo, which, as Ed Davey said this week, is awful. The status quo is awful, and we need to be doing something about it, right? Or we have the vision where Farage, Reform were 15 points ahead in that poll that's just come out. But here's my question. What happens after Farage fails? What happens after Nigel Farage and a Reform government fail? Because this, I think, is the rabbit hole that I kind of want to explore. Because for all of the people saying, we've got to have a general election now and we've got to get Reform in, when you look at their actual policies and you look at all of the issues that we've been talking about over the last few weeks, their policies make all of those issues worse, not better, right? So where do we go after he fails?
It's an interesting question. I probably haven't considered it much up to this point, partially because I think I still fear the actual him being in power in the first place. And also because, let me play devil's advocate for a second and ask the question. I know the answer already, but will he? Will he fail? It's like, are we completely wrong? Are we completely wrong in our view? Will he fail? Well, why? Why will he fail?
So, here it is, right? For a significant amount of time now, and we're going back at least 15 years, there have been a growing proportion of the electorate who are of the view that something is broken at a fundamental level in Britain, okay? So, the Brexit campaign. Why did we have a Brexit referendum in 2016? It was because people had been going up and up and up in their intensity with saying, we've got to go and do something. And Farage, leading UKIP, had told people, hey, this is the way to go. UKIP got almost 4 million votes in one of those elections. I think it was 2015, and 0 seats, which from a democracy, put my teeth back in, from a democracy perspective, is an outrage, right? If you got nearly 4 million votes, you should be winning seats. But there was this push. So Cameron says, okay, we'll have to have an in-out referendum and we'll go and do all of that. And then we've had this succession of people voting for big changes. So take back control, right? We had people coming out who had never voted, coming out and voting for Brexit in large numbers. That's how Brexit won. Take back control. And then there was some umming and ahhing in the parliament that followed and things weren't happening. So Boris Johnson becomes prime minister and Boris says, get Brexit done. Okay, so then another large people come out and vote for the second time in their lives to get Brexit done, and then Brexit happens, and then we start talking about build back better, and these are all slogans, right? So build back better, because we've got to go out there and improve things. And you had places that had had a Labour MP since the Dane Law suddenly have gone Tory, and people are being told, hey, we've got all of this town's money coming and you've got to go out there and bid for it. But relatively quickly, people realised that literally nothing had improved, and in fact, everything was still getting worse despite taking back control and then getting Brexit done and then building back better. So then you got another big change, and Labour come in. And now Labour have failed, and Labour are down to 20% in the latest poll and heading into the teens. And the next thing will be Farage. But inevitably, the thing that's made the Tories, two different kinds of the Tories, and Labour already fail, will also make Farage fail because none of them are addressing the fundamentals.
Yeah, no, all fair, all completely fair. And we wouldn't be doing this podcast if we weren't convinced of this reality. The country is, as we have said many times, fundamentally broken in a way that it has not been before, or it certainly hasn't been in our lifetime. And you don't fix that by just blaming one section of society and trying to make that the reason, and whether that was blaming the EU with Brexit, whether it was blaming immigrants and people on small boats or whatever else, or whether it's blaming work-shy people or whatever.
Blame scroungers, blame single mothers. Let's go back in time.
Exactly. We see this all the time, and that does not work. It gets votes, and that is one of the reasons. Those polls are where they are right now because people are angry, they're upset, they know that it's broken. Maybe they haven't put their finger on, maybe they don't know the why, they clearly don't know the why, and so they are scrambling to follow anyone who actually is willing to acknowledge this fact. And so I think when we bring it back to something like vision, part of I guess the other thing I'd probably challenge you on here is around, I don't think anyone has actually painted a vision yet. I think we both know that there is a vision. There is a vision of Nigel Farage wins a general election, probably with a stonking majority, and can go and do what he wants, and then discovers that it's actually far too hard.
Yep.
Because actually he can't do those things. A little bit like Donald Trump is discovering right now. And the alternative vision is, like you say, a status quo, which doesn't fix anything. We've had status quo politics since pretty much since Thatcher. That's what we've had, and we've just seen decline. So
and certainly that decline has got much worse, and you can see the statistics since the global financial crash. Since then, wages have stagnated and costs have gone whoop.
So what happens when, because actually let's think about, because we're being very matter of fact about, hey, Farage will obviously fail. We're pretty confident about that. But what happens? What happens when Farage is in power, and what happens after?
So let's talk about that. So Farage is pushing, people ultimately are banging on about migration, but let's also understand a lot of the people who are talking about migration aren't the people directly affected by it. And we've seen quite a few things on social media of places that are almost entirely white. So Stanley in County Durham being one of them, with people racially abusing African students and going on about you people doing this and that. None of those things are happening in Stanley, not in their community, but they've been told it's happening. So, but they're fed up because their community is getting poorer, it's getting scruffier, and ultimately they're helpless because they voted Labour, they voted Tory, they voted Brexit, and everything's still sliding downwards, right? So Farage is coming in basically saying that, look, we can wipe all of these problems away by taking the brown people out, right? Because actually that's all it comes down to. It is open racism now. Go and look at what people are saying. It's not the case that everybody supporting Reform UK is a racist. Far from it. But every racist supports Reform UK, with the exception of the ones where they aren't hardcore enough and they're now supporting Advance UK. We'll talk about them maybe in a little bit. And I don't know whether you've seen anything about the Reform versus Advance, but that's getting quite sketchy as well.
Yeah, Advance being the Stephen Yaxley Lennon, Tommy Robinson group.
Tommy Two Names, Ben Habib, Elon Musk now, the deport everybody who's brown party.
Yeah. I think, and it's important that we call this stuff out, right? Because and that point that you've just made is key as well. Look, we all know Reform voters. We all know people who are Reform voters. We might have family members who are Reform voters and stuff like that. It's not saying that all Reform voters are racist, but absolutely all racists are being pulled in to to the campaigns of Nigel Farage. It's very similar, and to use a left-wing analogy and stuff like that, is whenever there's a war, whenever there's stop the war protests, inevitably those protests bring in a certain subsection of very, very far extreme left people who are not there for necessarily the same reason you are. Yeah, it happens. It happens in on both sides of that divide.
It really does.
Yeah. I guess then when we think about, okay, so let's paint that picture, right? Nigel Farage has won the general election with a big enough majority so that he can get stuff done, a little bit like Boris Johnson in 2019. So what's he getting done? What's going to happen when he's in power?
Well, I mean, the key driver, the key deliverable that he will have to have is immigration. And he basically says, we're going to round people up, we're going to stick them into a camp, and then we're going to deport them, no ifs, no buts. Then there's a few ifs and buts, but hey, let's worry about that. Let's assume that with the dialogue at the moment, that things slide a little bit further and we actually have the British version of ICE, right? So some of the balaclavaed patriots that we've seen, who are allegedly just families, they look like balaclavaed thugs to me, but hey, let's assume some of these guys join ICE and that ICE starts them just lifting people off the street and deporting them. So Farage suddenly, right, finds a way to break every international law and treaty there is, and suddenly you start to see this exodus of migrants, recent migrants into Britain, all start leaving, right? That, I think, is the future that some of the people supporting reform actually want. And that would clearly produce some euphoria in some people and disgust in other people, and probably you and I might sit on that camp. But it doesn't fix the problems. Because why have we got all of the stuff against migration? Well, it's, they're coming out there and they're taking jobs and they're raping women and they're claiming benefits. Well, they don't get benefits. They're not taking people's jobs because migrants come to fill the jobs that our people don't want. That's always been the case with waves of migration, right? Where you have a gap in the labour market, with jobs that people are either unskilled or unwilling to do, migrant labour comes and fills the gap. So when you take those out, you will end up like we had during COVID. And if you remember, in COVID, there was basically the inability to be able to bring more people in, and there was a campaign to get people going out into the fields and picking fruit. We had a fruit and vegetable harvest and no workforce to go out there and do it. And there was this push, the government were doing it, Prince Charles, as he still was then, talking about doing it, and people would go onto a farm, they'd realise that it's backbreaking and boring and awful, and quit after a day. Right? That's the reality of this. So if you've taken the workforce away who do the actual work, right, then the people who are left are sat unable to do a whole load of jobs. What does that mean? It means less people paying tax. So not only are you losing the bodies doing stuff, but you've got less people paying tax, which means less money circulating through the economy, which means less jobs because money needs to circulate to keep businesses afloat to employ people. And things get even worse. We have got this long-term population decline. And Elon Musk sometimes is right? And I've been bashing him quite a lot this week on social media, but he is right about the population decline. Who's going to earn the money to pay for the people that are here to actually have a decent retirement? Because there's not enough working people, which again is why we have migration.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I get it, and I think the other pieces around this, just to kind of expand on it a little bit more in terms of, less money going into the public coffers to pay for services and things like that, but also prices will go up as well. The cost of everything, because if less stuff is being manufactured, if less stuff is being made, if less fruit is being harvested, the cost will inevitably go up. The trade deals that we do with other countries are, this was always a thing about take back control and everything else and being in total control of our sovereignty. There's no such thing as total control of your sovereignty in a globalized economy. No. We have to have trade deals. Trade deals are exactly that. They're a negotiation. They're a deal between two groups. And
it's a deal.
It's a deal, yeah. And there's no such deal where one country gets everything and the other country gets nothing. That's not a deal.
Sorry, I thought we held all the cards, Nigel. I thought we held all the cards. What happened to that?
Yeah, I mean, that is the Yeah, I mean, people
The
love
easiest
to
trade deal in history. Do you
easiest
remember?
trade deals in history. Yeah, exactly. But
Lies.
again, those trade deals that we will need to be done with our neighbors, our partners, other countries. Those other countries are not going to deal with us
No.
as well as they would if we were being a law-abiding member of the international community, which we would not be under a
And we can
Nigel
see
Farage
that with what's happening with Donald Trump. So Donald Trump is
Yes.
ripping up all of the rules, ripping up agreements, and basically acting like an absolute unpredictable person. Let's be very kind and gentle, right? Because he's ill, probably. He's doing all of that, and the deals that he thinks that he's doing, he then goes and changes every couple of months. So, as an example, Spain today ripped up a deal to buy American arms and now buying European arms instead. Because why would you do a deal with somebody who doesn't actually follow the things that they say they're going to do, right? If, my word is my bond. Well, if it isn't, why should I do anything? And this is exactly what UK would be. As you say, we're going to rip up every international law and treaty that we disagree with, or arbitrarily. Please come and trade with us.
Yeah. Some of which we should point out, some of those laws and treaties we wrote, which is very, very important, including, for example, the human rights law for the European Court of Human Rights. We actually wrote, it was British lawyers who wrote that in the first place. But hey, that's just a little pet peeve that we're trying to get away from.
Just to build on this a little bit, though, so we've had this, right? We've got a Farage government. We have successfully taken a whole load of people out by ripping up a load of international treaties. We've turned into a bit of an international pariah, but we're still thumping our chest and saying how amazing we are. One of the things that allegedly winds people up is that their money, instead of being spent on, homeless veterans and, our people and the homeless and all the rest of it, is being spent on these foreigners. But the irony, of course, is that the kind of people who back reform, and back reform loudly, are the exact same people who read the newspapers who say that the homeless and the poor are scroungers, and then vote against giving these people any money. So money might get freed up by some migrants disappearing in terms of payments to them, but as you said, as we've just been saying, the economy shrinks. And the people that they're saying should get the money are going to be told to go and do one by these same people as well. So again, how does anything get better? It just gets worse.
No, exactly. I mean, I think the one thing that I would caution against in terms of the failure of Farage, in that he will absolutely, if he gets into power, his government will fail in that the the economy will crash and ultimately he will get torn from office just like any other democratically elected leader is when they fail. The problem is in the art of I don't even know what the word is, but some kind of brainwashing / subjugation
Propaganda.
/ the propaganda that goes with being a dictator in that sense and being in control of the situation. So I always consider it a little bit like the frog in boiling water, right? It's like we've seen it throughout history. Populations where their lives are getting worse, but they still look to glorious leader because all they're hearing is you've never had it so good. Things are getting better and better and better. And I'm not saying that is what will happen, but there are examples in history where that has happened.
So here's the point, right? I'm going to go back to fairly recent history because Alexander Boris Dufeffel Johnson, right, was an absolutely brilliant political propagandist. Okay, great communicator, right? His own unique style, but he came up with all of this stuff and bring people along and all the rest of it, and basically got people really, really excited. We are going to build back better. We're going to improve your lives, your communities, and do all of those things, and got all of these people backing him. The problem is when you then don't deliver actual results, propaganda doesn't really help you anymore. People actually think that if I voted for this guy who's definitely going to make things better and things aren't getting better, then you can have propaganda fed at you as much as you like. People stop listening to it. And we've seen that already. And even with Farage, you can see the cracks already forming, and the Advance UK faction, the even harder right. Another brilliant propagandist is Stephen Yaxley Lennon. Look, I'm not going to call him Tommy Robinson because he's an act. That's a character that he's playing. Yeah, Jonathan Pye is not the name of the person. It's just Tommy Robinson is the same thing. But look at what he's saying and how he's saying it and the way that he presents lies, right, and racism and othering. He's very effective at it. Now, stick him and Elon Musk together and stick the obvious failure, which they haven't even launched the policy properly, reform, and they're already having to row back on, well, maybe we're not going to deport women and kids. Oh, well, maybe we do have to deport women and kids. They can't get it right because it's not actually easy. It can't just be done by slogan. What did I call it the other week? Crayon politics.
Yeah, crayon politics.
Crayon politics doesn't actually get things done. And in this case, he's going to find it really, 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 really hard. So when migrants aren't just going to disappear overnight, communities aren't suddenly going to get better, right? You're going to still see a lot of these problems. And even with your really good propaganda being fed at them, people still tend to get to a point where when they're told you are better off and they can demonstrate that they're worse off, they tend to go, hang on a second, you're lying. And the Tories found this out last year when, again, at the point where they were raising taxes, they were out there saying, we're cutting taxes. And people would go, well, I hear you saying you're cutting taxes, but why am I paying more taxes? And it's this point. You can only deflect reality for so long.
Yeah, and look, and I think there's two things to that. One is if you need to tell people they've never had it so good and their lives are great, then the chances are it's probably not the case, right? It's like people's lives did improve. Yeah, overall, like, people's lives did improve during the Tony Blair years. They did. I still maintain that everything was built on shifting sands, and that has been ultimately proven. But lives did improve, and people didn't need to be told their lives were improving. They just knew it. They felt it. They felt things were getting better. In the 1950s and 60s, they felt that their lives were getting better and the lives for their children. Yeah. But the moment you have to start telling people that, you're probably lying or trying to convince yourself. And the second thing is, for me, it's around how long it takes for people to recognize that, right? Because that's the fear for me, is like, okay, Nigel Farage gets into power. How long does it take? Like, if we take the Tories when they were last in power, right? Austerity was a hated and disastrous situation, right? It really should not have been allowed to happen in the way that it did. And yet, 5 years in, lots of anger around what was going on, but they still got elected. Again, there's lots of reasons why that happened.
Well, hang on. Just before we go past that, but don't forget that in 2010, the choice was austerity or austerity, right? That for as bad as austerity was during the coalition, and the sums are there, and we can both point to the fact that this was the wrong call. The Labour manifesto was for even more austerity than the coalition delivered. So there wasn't really a no austerity choice being offered. Everybody was in the same place after the crash. Sorry, I interrupted, but I think that's part of why it took so long on that one.
No, that's fair, and that actually leads in quite nicely to the next point around vision, which is, if nobody is offering an alternative to Nigel Farage, or a true alternative to Nigel Farage, then that's how he ends up staying in power for a longer period, because there has to be a true alternative vision. Because right now, and look, there was stuff today just released from from Downing Street about changes to effectively moving in the direction of reform to try and win those votes. It's constant moving in that direction to try and win votes back by getting stricter on asylum seekers, getting stricter on immigration, and all this kind of stuff.
Will it work?
No, of course it won't work, because reform will move even further in that hateful direction. And so that's the reason why, look, ultimately where we want to get to is, we want to get to a point where Nigel Farage doesn't get elected. Yeah. The polls are petrifying right now, but there is an opportunity, and that opportunity remains the vision. What is the vision, the alternative vision, the anti-Farage vision that can be painted for British people today?
Well, I mean, how can I put this? The various politicians of various parties have touched on it over the years. I mean, do you remember Gordon Brown's British Jobs for British Workers? And that's 2009.
Yeah.
Okay? He kind of recognised that we're getting to the point where we've got to start promoting this. And I think everybody's talked about it, and he got harangued for that. But you can argue, well, he's right, because, look, The reason why we have waves of migration, whether it's the Windrush generation, whether it's people coming from like the Indian subcontinent through the 60s and the 70s, whether it is the wave of Eastern Europeans that we had 20 odd years ago, it's because there's a gap in the labour force that we can't actually fill. So there's two things that we can do about this, and they're both quite long term. And one of them is that we've largely stopped training people to do jobs. Now, whether that's business, and we've talked about this, business not investing in jobs and skills and whatever, but as a country, we've kind of given up. We've given up on the idea that, you know, Britain is the engineers of the world and we build things. We don't build things. We still build a few things, but nuclear power being a prime example, where we want nuclear reactors and we're now having to pay the French government to install reactor designs so old that the French aren't installing them anymore. That's the level of stupid that we've got ourselves into. Below big engineering, we're importing builders, brickies, electricians, carpenters from Eastern Europe because we didn't have enough. And even now, build 1.5 million houses across the Parliament, we don't have the people to do it. So we need to start training people up. And that is going to take a generation. You've got to start off with, we're going to need a big expansion in the apprenticeship scheme that's actually viable. We need technical colleges to go and train these things. We've got to create the things first and then get people into them and then make these careers sexy again. So sorry, Simon Cowell, a lot of this is your fault, but we've got to get away from the whole, you know, people just talking at a screen on YouTube like we're doing, right? Bad, bad, bad. The other part of it, the population decline, right? And this is the bit where I'm going to get myself into trouble. Basically, we have got to get people shagging. Because if you look at all of the research that's being done on it, younger people are having less sex than our generation did. Now, you might think we didn't have enough sex, right? But the younger generations are having even less sex, and therefore they're having even fewer babies. And that means our population decline, the birth rate per woman as average, is at the lowest that it's been, I think, ever. And it's not just here, it's across Western Europe and other Western countries. So, again, if we actually want more workers in the future to do the things that we need and then to pay taxes and to have money circulating so that we can still have businesses that employ other people doing things, the birth rate needs to come up. But it's not a sexy topic for politicians, if you'll pardon the pun, because all they want to talk about is, I'm going to do this in the next 2 years. And we're talking about something over 20 years. But the vision for Britain, the big picture thing is, we've got to rebuild our population, rebuild our skills, rebuild our drive and our energy for actually making things like we used to do. Because it's not that we've forgotten and we can't ever do it again. We've just got to try.
Yeah, look, I think, and the reason why it's controversial to talk about, you know, we need to, you know, government is because you're talking about government legislating or at least encouraging people to have more children, which of course immediately starts to get into, you know, the idea of freedom, right? Personal freedoms and personal choice. But you're not at all wrong. If we think back to the baby boomer era and everything else, it's like we just had a massive war and people, you know, and people came back from war and they all started having lots of babies, which was, you know, because they'd been through the war, been through a war and been through an unbelievable crisis. We don't have that, and we don't particularly want that. So it's a case of we need to find a way to drive. But by the same token, a lot of people won't have kids, not just because of, I mean, there's all kind of social reasons and everything else, but a lot of people won't have kids because it's really expensive to have kids, you know, and people are constantly being told, you know, well, maybe you shouldn't have had a second child if you can't afford it. Maybe you shouldn't do that, you know, or a third child if we want to talk about benefits.
That is literally the point that you've neatly pivoted onto where I was going with this anyway. We have created a hostile environment, not for migrants, but for British babies, right? We have made it a terrible place to have a child and bring somebody into the world because, you know, everything is expensive and childcare costs the same as a mortgage with some people. And then the actual support that you get from the state has got less and less. Things like Sure Start got removed. You could argue, did you need those in the first place? Well, that's because we lost skills and things. That gets taken away. And then all you get is this barrage, as you said in the media, a barrage of hate against people having babies. Why are people having babies? Why am I paying for your babies and education? The whole mindset needs
Yeah.
to change. Because
Yeah.
if we're not going to have foreign workers coming in, we need more British workers, British jobs for British workers, as Gordon Brown said. But to do that, you actually have to have the workers. And at the moment, we're not growing enough of them.
No. I think that's a completely fair point. But the way you do it is by creating an environment that is child friendly, that is baby making friendly.
Yes.
It's like that's ultimately what it comes down to. I think when I tend to think about vision, if I was, in my, I always talk about how there hasn't been a great prime minister in my lifetime, right? In what I consider a great prime minister, there's been a couple of visionary ones,
Mm.
not necessarily visions that I adhere to, but for me, there hasn't been truly a great person kind of stepping forward. When I think about a visionary, what we need right now, it is the kind of person who can step forward. And first of all, they do have to do the hard bit, the first hard bit, which is getting people to recognize just how bad it is. I mentioned the frogs in the frogs in boiling water. That's like the British population, right? For however many decades,
Yep.
we have been frogs in boiling, slowly increasing water temperature, boiling ourselves, cooking to death,
Mm.
not realizing just how bad things have got. It's only when you look back and say, this is what we had in 1970 versus this is what we
Yeah.
have today, that you're like, whoa, how did that happen?
Yeah.
And that is the thing. The first thing that any potential visionary leader has got to do is open up to the British people in a way that Nigel Farage hasn't done. Because yeah, he talks about things being broken, but he immediately pivots straight onto it's immigrants' fault.
He makes too much money off the
Yeah,
status quo, right?
of course.
Nigel Farage, the former stockbroker.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so it needs to be someone who's willing to put their head up, and take the risk and say, look, it's broken. Everything's broken. The NHS is broken. The whole system the way in which we elect our governments, everything we in this country, the established order, is fundamentally broken. And then pivot onto, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
And when it comes to painting a vision, I always think it comes down to two things. One is, what is your life going to be like? If we fast forward 10 years, 20 years, what is the life like for you and your kids? I've used for the last few episodes that example of, a full-time wage in 1970 could paid enough money, an average wage that is, paid enough money to feed, clothe, house your kids, and leave enough money left over at the end of the month to pay for the nicer things in life and put money away for a rainy day, right?
Yep.
That is a vision, right?
Yep.
A vision for the future. So if a politician to come out and say, we want to get back to that. We want to do that. Then the second piece is, how do we do it, right? I mean, you've mentioned a couple of really important long-term pieces, which are absolutely true and we need to do. For me, it's about what is our industrial strategy? What is our strategy to create jobs, right?
Yeah.
What is our strategy? Because again, no nation, if they with a population the size that we have and with the kind of economy that we currently have, can survive by being way down the list on all the new industries that are being created. We can't just be we'll take those jobs from abroad, which is what's happening, right? If you have a big China leads the world in a particular technology, say for example renewable technologies right now, they've pivoted into that, they're leading the world. There are jobs for British workers in Britain in factories owned and operated and profits going from
Yes.
out of the country to somewhere else. We need the industrial strategy to lead and create our own
And that
industry.
that is the key point, because of all of the things that we still make, and I said we don't make anything. That is not true.
Yeah.
We do still make a few things, but of all of the stuff, we largely do not own it. Or where we own it, we have to bring in investment from outside to put actual capital in to be able to grow and develop the thing, because we can't do so ourselves. And unless you can turn some of that around, we cannot compete with the countries who still own their own industries. Because Part of the reason why Germany has been such a powerhouse is because Germany has not let the likes of Volkswagen be sold off. It is German. The reason why Norway has got so much money is because, unlike us in the early and mid 80s, we didn't privatize oil and gas. They didn't privatize it, they kept it. So all of the money and the control and all the rest of it has come in. The only way we're going to get there, we can't just say, right, well, we're going to buy everything back. You're absolutely right. We've got to start working on developing the new things. And I've said it for ages that renewables is one way through this. It's not just that at the moment we're putting up all of these offshore wind farms and the turbines are largely made somewhere else because we're not building this stuff ourselves. But developing the new technology, tidal being a huge way that we can go. Design it. We've got brilliant science people. We've got brilliant universities, and our engineering skills are huge. So design it, build it, export it. It's not just the solution for our own energy, but it's a way for us to make money from the rest of the world, which is called trade, which is what everybody needs.
Yeah.
You're right. The vision thing has got to be making things again.
Exactly. And that is the bit where, and look, a country can create the environment that A, incentivizes the entrepreneurs to go and invent and create, the universities to actually be focused on those things as well, which solves some of the problems we've got there, but then also create what is effectively a more hostile environment for other countries trying to bring their wares in. This is effectively what part of what Donald Trump is trying to do. He's just the way he's doing it with a sledgehammer and one policy, which is put tariffs on people rather than no, we start by investing. Let's start by investing and creating competition in our country, and then we can be a bit more sledgehammery with our. But you can't do it when it's like he wants to make he wants car manufacturing to come back to the United States. Well, unless you're planning to rebuild Detroit with the trillions of dollars that would cost. Your tariffs aren't going to do anything there, okay? So I like what you're saying about things like tidal and stuff like that. I actually think it's shameful that on an island of this size, we are not actually leading the world in tidal and hydroelectric, because we should be. We literally could. The amount of power we could generate just for ourselves is insane. But the technology as well that could be, again, developed in our universities, invented in our universities, developed in industries that are owned by Britain, by the taxpayer, and then sold off to all those other countries around the world. It's huge. The potential is there. There just has to be the initial investment.
So to try and wrap this up so we can end it and then also lead into like sort of future shows. The big vision thing. So we've had the scary Nigel Farage view of the world and where Farage fails and then frankly gets replaced by Yaxley Lennon or somebody. That's the authoritarian play. The other play is that we actually, have politicians now who grow up a hell. Let's say Keir Starmer wakes up tomorrow and says, right, we're going to have a referendum on rejoining the EU, right, and completely shakes up the whole political map, because he could, because people would support it, right? I'm not saying he will, but things can change a lot over the next 4 years. But whoever it is, the big picture vision thing that I think we need to start bolting things onto we've got to increase the size of the population is point one. We've got to educate the population. So stop saying we can't afford teachers and we can't afford properly funded universities or so on. We've then got to come up with the technologies of tomorrow and the engineering skills and the manufacturing capabilities to make it and then export it to the world again. It's a new industrial revolution. And I know it is that, that's far too big and scary. Well, hang on a second. Other countries are literally doing it right now. And supposedly AI is the next revolution that's coming. And we think that we're going to be somewhere on the leading edge of it. So there are opportunities for us to do it. But you've actually got to start with the end in mind. What am I trying to achieve? And it's got to be a country that's actually fit for the future. Because at the moment, we're just crumbling into ruin.
Into the sea. No, it's all completely true. Look, there's loads that we could dig into a lot deeper here in terms of things like those industries. One thing that I'd love to touch on in a future episode is the idea of how can we, I guess, change a generational viewpoint that there are certain jobs that we're too good for, And I mean all of those trades that
Yes.
that we've talked about, right? They are skilled trades, but somehow we have managed to convince ourselves, all of us, that they're lower than white collar service jobs, right? And it'd be great to kind of get into that a bit
You
more.
meant well, very, very, very. Let me leave you then with a picture. So you mentioned propaganda earlier, right? And I think that I would class Pop Idol and things like that as propaganda. Again, I'm blaming Simon Cowell, right? But we have made it so that being a chef is sexy and it's cool and all the rest of it. You've got all of these cooking shows that everybody goes on about. Do the same thing for construction, right? We've had grand designs on for years talking about things that had already been built, but no, no, no. What we need to do is we need to get it so that you've got the new generation wanting to go and compete and actually building these amazing structures and things. Look, here's what I've created. Oh, fantastic. Let's get the public behind it. Because if we don't get it so that people, as you say, want to do these jobs, then nobody will. And then you'll end up again with migrant labour, which apparently is a bad thing. So we've got you've got to make construction cool. You've got to like build for Britain. All of the wartime propaganda stuff that we
Yeah.
used to have, bring it back again.
100%, 100%. So look, lots to talk about on future episodes. If you're loving what we do, do of course like, subscribe, click the bell, do all of that kind of stuff. We really enjoy making these. We'll put out a whole load of reels as always, and be back for another one pretty soon. But
Yeah,
thank you, Ian. I've
and you,
enjoyed
Nigel.
talking vision, even if some of it was negative.
And some of it was sexy.
Exactly, exactly. Make make bricklaying great again. There we go.
Absolutely. And we'll see you on the next one.
See you on the next one. Thank you.